Your shoulders are tight, your jaw aches, and the third cup of cold coffee sits untouched because the positive statements feel like shouting into a locked room that will not open. You are not failing because you forgot to think positively. You are failing because you have been forcing the bright side so loudly that you cannot hear what the inner alarm is actually trying to signal. This is not a story about giving up on optimism. It is a story about what happens when a well-meaning psychological tool starts working against the mind that wields it. And the central question is this: why can a determined effort to stay positive leave someone feeling more distressed, more exhausted, and less capable of solving the real problem in front of them? A common belief holds that replacing a negative thought with a positive one works like switching a channel. Cut the gloomy signal, insert the hopeful broadcast, and the emotional weather inside the mind will eventually change. This approach has a name in everyday culture: positive thinking. The instruction is familiar, and the promise feels intuitive. If fear is the enemy, then fight it with courage. If criticism stings, drown it in praise. The sticky note ritual is not useless. Under certain conditions, deliberately focusing on strengths or hopeful outcomes can lift mood, reduce stress, and widen the range of actions a person considers. The first turns arrives here. The label positive thinking has been applied, but the label cannot explain why the panic intensified alongside the affirmations instead of dissolving beneath them. What if the effort to banish every uncomfortable feeling is not a solution but an additional burden, another task piled on top of the already overwhelming demand? To understand why, consider a quieter version of the mind. Close your eyes and try very hard for 1 minute not to think about a white bear. Do not picture its fur, its claws, or its quiet dark eyes. If you are like most people, the bear will trample through your imagination repeatedly. The instruction to suppress the thought becomes the very reason the thought keeps returning. The checking itself keeps the unwanted thought active, like a security guard who must constantly think about the intruder in order to confirm that the intruder is not entering. The guard cannot forget the face. Now apply that same dynamic to worry. Telling yourself do not think about failing, only think about succeeding, splits your mental energy. A part of you must scan for failure in order to flag it for dismissal. The scanning sharpens your sensitivity to threat cues. A small typo becomes evidence of incompetence. A delayed response from a colleague becomes proof that you are being judged. The anxiety intensifies not despite the positive affirmations, but partly because of them. The sticky note that said, "I am confident," did not fail because the person lacks willpower. It failed because the very act of painting bright paint over a crack drew more attention to the crack beneath. Psychological research distinguishes between two forms of coping that sound similar but operate differently. Problem-focused coping targets the situation itself, making a plan, breaking a task into steps, asking for clarification. Emotion-focused coping aims to manage the feelings that arise, seeking comfort, reframing the meaning, or using the kind of positive self-talk that aims to shift an internal emotional state. Positive thinking often functions as emotion-focused coping. When it is applied to a problem that requires concrete action, the gap between the soothing words and the unchanged reality can widen. Imagine a passenger on a ship that has sprung a leak. Saying, "The sea is calm and the hull is strong," might ease panic for a moment, but it does not plug the hole. The water keeps rising. The person at the mirror was still facing an unclear scope of work, limited time, and no email clarifying what the project reviewer actually needed. The affirmation could not substitute for the missing information. The second turn is this: positive thinking, when used as a universal suppression strategy, can become a second job. The exhausting work of silencing internal experience instead of navigating it. Emotions are not design flaws. Even unpleasant ones deliver data. Anxiety can signal unpreparedness. Sadness can signal loss that needs attention. Frustration can signal a blocked goal that requires a different route. When you insist that you must feel only hope, you mute the dashboard lights before checking the engine. The warning does not disappear. It merely stops being available as information you can use. Researchers who study emotional regulation have found that people who accept their negative emotions without judging them tend to experience better mental health over time than those who routinely suppress or avoid those emotions. Acceptance does not mean wallowing or giving up. It means acknowledging the presence of an emotion without letting it dictate your next action, and without building a second layer of distress about having the emotion in the first place. A student who thinks, "I feel terrified because this exam matters to me," and then studies anyway, is in a different psychological position than the student who thinks, "I feel terrified," which means I am a coward and I must not think about failing. The first student carries the fear lightly. The second student carries the fear plus the weight of a meta-emotion, the shame of feeling fear at all. That shame consumes even more mental energy. Cognitive resources are limited. Attention, working memory, and self-control all draw from a shared pool. The more energy you spend policing your own mind for unacceptable thoughts, the less you have available for the actual task. That is why the cursor kept blinking without any new words appearing. The brain's central executive was occupied with an internal debate. Stop worrying. No, I am worrying again. Why can't I stop? Rather than composing the next sentence. The third turn arrives when we recognize that the real cost is not a failure of mood, but a measurable performance cost. The safety gear became part of the obstacle. This does not mean that pessimism is superior to optimism. A clear-eyed awareness of difficulty paired with a belief that you can cope, sometimes called realistic optimism, can be protective and productive. Realistic optimism sounds less like nothing will go wrong and more like difficult things might happen, and I can probably find ways to manage them. The focus shifts from guaranteeing a perfect outcome to trusting your capacity to respond. Contrast this with what psychologists sometimes call toxic positivity, the social or internal pressure to dismiss, minimize, or invalidate authentic distress with cheerful cliches. Just think good thoughts can feel like an eraser aimed at your reality. When someone shares a genuine struggle and receives a bright, blanketing reassurance in return, the hidden message can be, your uncomfortable feeling is unwelcome here. Connection breaks. What they needed in that moment was not a louder cheer, but a different internal move. A pause that could hold both the hope and the worry without demanding that the worry vanish first. Psychological flexibility offers a framework. It involves turning toward experience with curiosity, noticing thoughts as temporary mental events rather than commands, and choosing actions based on what matters rather than on immediate emotional comfort. The thought, "I am going to mess this up," can be observed and labeled as a worry, much like seeing a dark cloud pass across a window. The cloud is real as an event, but it does not have to become the entire weather report for the afternoon. This labeling creates a small but crucial separation between the person and the thought. You are the sky containing passing weather, rather than being the storm itself. Research in clinical psychology has tested approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, which explicitly teach this skill. Studies show that deliberate acceptance of difficult internal experiences can reduce their power to disrupt meaningful activity. But this is not a simple fix. It requires practice, and most people will still get hooked by painful thoughts many times a day. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a slightly wider gap between the thought and the urge to either believe it fully or kill it immediately. In the widened gap, the blurring cursor becomes less a symbol of personal failure and more a neutral object. The project becomes a series of small decisions rather than a monument to one's worth. Putting fears into language on a private page seems to reduce their churn. The translation from chaotic feeling to structured words reduces the cognitive load that suppression demands. The person at the desk, if they had opened a blank document, not for the project, but for an honest 10-minute download of every anxious thought, might have freed working memory for the actual task. This highlights a paradox. Making room for negativity can create the mental space that forced positivity occupies and exhausts. The mind clears not by evicting unwanted guests, but by letting them sit quietly in the corner while work continues. There is no single emotional style that fits every person, every culture, or every life phase. The problem is not the presence of positive thinking in the toolkit. The problem is the insistence that one tool must fix every engine. Positive reappraisal, finding genuine benefit or growth in hardship, can be healthy when it emerges authentically from processing and experience, not when it is used as a gag to silence crying before the crying has finished. The distinction lies in timing and permission. Early in a stressor, the mind often needs to map the threat accurately. Late in recovery, a search for meaning can promote healing. Flipping the order can produce a brittle shell over an unhealed wound. The fourth turn is this: the most resilient people do not feel fewer negative emotions. They may actually feel a wide range of emotions and possess the flexibility to navigate them without becoming consumed or controlled by any single one. Studies of resilience often find that adaptive coping involves accurately appraising stress, using available support, tolerating discomfort, and maintaining a sense of purpose, not eliminating doubt, fear, or grief. The sticky note on the mirror would become more useful if it read, "This feels hard, and I can begin anyway." The small addition of honesty about difficulty prevents the note from becoming a demand to feel what you do not feel. Return again to the desk, now later that night. The person stopped repeating the forced mantra and instead wrote down exactly what they were afraid of. Disappointing a mentor, losing a future opportunity, confirming a secret belief they were not smart enough. Those fears, when named explicitly on a scratch pad, occupied less space than when they had to shout over the sound of forced cheer. The crisis did not evaporate, but the internal battle quieted enough for a single realistic paragraph to be typed. Another part is emotional. The meta-emotion of shame about feeling bad compounds the load. A third part is practical. When discomfort is treated as a signal of failure rather than a signal of need, people stop attending to the actual need. The deepest layer may be relational. Positive thinking, when turned into a rigid internal rule, can cut a person off from the social support that comes from saying, "I am struggling," and letting another person offer presence, not solutions. Humans evolved to communicate distress. A grimace, a sigh, a vulnerable confession are ancient signals that call for help in bond groups. A culture that demands unbroken smiles can accidentally silence the very signals that bring care. None of this means that chronic rumination is healthier. Spinning in endless circles of worry without action also impairs problem solving and wears down the body's stress systems. The alternative is not unchecked negativity. It is a flexible middle ground where thoughts and feelings are noticed, evaluated for usefulness, and neither suppressed nor obeyed blindly. A worry thought like, "I might lose my job," can be treated as a hypothesis to examine rather than a prophecy to accept or a demon to exorcise. Is this worry true? What evidence exists? What small step could I take to increase control? That cognitive appraisal belongs to the tradition of cognitive behavioral therapy, which does not dismiss negative automatic thoughts, but gently examines their accuracy and usefulness before generating more balanced alternatives. Crucially, balanced alternatives are not necessarily sunny. A balanced thought after examination might be, "There is a real risk, and I can cope with uncertainty while I update my skills and talk to my manager." that is more precise than everything will be fine. The shift from forced positivity to flexible accuracy changes the relationship a person has with their own inner voice. The inner voice becomes a source of tentative data rather than a bully that must be silenced by a cheerleader on demand. As the night deepened, the person at the desk noticed that the anxiety had not vanished, but it had stopped growing. The email that needed writing still sat there, but the dread no longer felt like a personal indictment. It felt like a reasonable response to a difficult situation that still required action. This is the threshold of the climax. The mind that had been exhausting itself fighting to feel good found a more stable position by allowing the truth of the moment to be exactly what it was: uncomfortable, uncertain, and still navigable. The greatest strength was not the ability to generate 5 positive statements for every worry. It was the willingness to hold both the hope of succeeding and the real possibility of falling short, without letting either possibility prevent the next small move. The climax of this exploration lands exactly here. The mind that allows the full range of its experience becomes more resilient than the mind that works hard to hear only a major chord. The answer to our dramatic question emerges. Forcing optimism can worsen distress and block action because it demands a massive internal suppression operation, generates shame about natural emotional responses, misdirects attention away from solvable problems, and trades genuine agency for hollow emotional performance. Positive thinking is not a harmful practice in itself. It becomes counterproductive when it morphs into a rigid command to feel good at the expense of noticing what is actually happening inside and around you. The reversal changes the meaning of the opening scene. The sticky note on the mirror, the forced cheer, the tight jaw. These were not signs of insufficient effort. They were signs of a mind trapped in a loop where the solution had become part of the problem. What the moment actually required was not more positivity, but more accurate contact with reality and a gentler, more permissive relationship with the emotions that reality provoked. This insight does not suggest that anyone should abandon hope, encouragement, or the practice of cultivating gratitude. Those remain valuable when they are genuine responses to what is good, not clubs used to beat down what is difficult. The person at the desk finally sent the email. The body did not flood with ecstatic relief. The jaw still ached, but the silence in the room felt different, less like a cage, more like a still pond that could hold the reflection without shattering it. They understood that the goal had never been to banish anxiety. The goal had been to complete a project while carrying anxiety as a passenger rather than capitulating to it as a hijacker. And that was an entirely different assignment. The central reversal is now complete. Strength here looks less like a wall of confident affirmations and more like a willingness to move forward with the full, honest weight of the moment. After the climax, the release. The exhausting performance of permanent cheer can be set down. What replaces it is not pessimism, but a quiet willingness to meet what arises without adding a second layer of internal combat. Practical options begin from this quieter stance. Next time the pressure builds, you might set a timer for 5 minutes and write down every anxious thought without editing, just to externalize the noise onto paper, where it becomes an object you can look at rather than a fog you live inside. You might revise the sticky note to say something that acknowledges the struggle and the next action. I am anxious about this presentation, and I will prepare one slide at a time. The sentence includes the feeling without surrendering the leadership of your own behavior. You might notice that when a friend shares distress, the most helpful response is often not a quick reframe, but an honest acknowledgement. That sounds really hard right now. Simple presence often outperforms forced repair. These are small behavioral experiments, not universal cures. Their purpose is to shift the role of thinking from a policing function to an observing and problem-solving function. There will still be days when the old habit returns and the mind begins chanting positive slogans to drown out fear. The difference is that now you have a name for that pattern and an understanding that the fatigue it produces is not a sign of personal failure, but a predictable consequence of trying to mentally hold a beach ball underwater. Let the beach ball surface. It will bob next to you on the water. You can still swim while it floats there. The energy previously spent on submersion becomes available for actual movement. But the person sitting at the desk is no longer fighting a two-front war against the external project and against their own internal weather. The war against the self has been called off. That does not guarantee a perfect outcome. It guarantees that the problem in front of them gets the largest share of finite attention, because attention is no longer entirely consumed by the battle to feel only clean and gleaming emotions. Scientific psychology does not hand out mirrors that reflect only what we wish to see. It offers a lens that can bring both the light and the shadow into focus, not to scare us, but to help us navigate by the real contours of the terrain. And in the quiet after the email was sent, the person noticed that the shame had receded. In its place was a quieter feeling, not triumph, but a steady, honest tiredness that felt, for the first time that day, completely manageable. They did not need to feel like a superhero. They only needed to feel like a human being doing a difficult thing. That permission is what the sticky note in its original form had inadvertently denied. The next morning, the mirror note was replaced. The new handwriting read, "You will probably feel uncertain again today, and you can still do what matters." The reflection that stared back was not beaming. It was present, and it was enough. How you relate to your inner world shapes every outer act. Being whole does not mean being happy about every part of yourself. It means ceasing to exile the parts you cannot currently change, so that all of your energy can flow into the life you are actually living.